back to Grandpa's School of Hot Rod Building. Today we're going to talk about transmissions. Now your S10 came with either a manual or an automatic transmission. Here's two models that were probably your most common. Chevrolet used quite a variety of different transmissions over the years, but these are probably the most common. But the question most people have is, can I use the transmission my S10 came with? Well, the answer to that depends on a lot of factors, which we're going to talk about today. When I bought my S10, it ran. It made a lot of noise in the transmission, and it had over 200,000 miles on it, I'd guess. And it really was worn out. A lot of these S10s, they're older trucks, they're going to be worn out. You're going to need to either rebuild your transmission, purchase a remanufactured transmission. Some people go to the salvage yard and get a light model, one out of a light model. And some people have the skills and the equipment to do it themselves. Also, you're going to need to interface with there's a takeoff on the tailstock that gives the signal for the drive shaft rotational speed. And that's what feeds up to your speedometer on the dashboard. All the new ones are digital. The old mechanical ones, if you're going to put the newer instrument clusters in your vehicle, there's these little adapters you can mount onto the takeoff at the tailstock, and it gives you a good signal. It's just two wires, really easy to hook up. Manual transmissions, your expenses beyond the rebuilding or purchase is your flywheel, clutch linkage, clutch pedal assembly if you don't already have one, and a shifter, of course. Automatic transmissions, you have your electronic interface between the transmission and the throttle valve. The newer engines, that's done electronically. Old engines, they have just a cable that runs up. There's some tricks to that, so I added that as an expense. You're going to need a flex plate, a torque converter, which we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. You're got to run some coolant lines out to keep your transmission cool, and of course that you need a radiator that has the ports for it, and a radiator designed especially for transmission cooling. And there you need a shift kit. Now I went with the B&M hammer shifter. I like that shifter. It has a good automatic mode, and I can kick it into sort of a semi-manual mode if I want to, and it's kind of fun to play. Biggest concern you're going to have is to make sure that you don't shred your transmission. If your S10 came with a V6, that transmission should work with you only if you use street tires. Yeah, you're going to use a bigger engine. It's going to have a lot more power, but your back wheels are going to break loose because it's a lightweight car. So you can use it. It'll work. It'll be fine. Now your bell housing will only fit the short block Chevy engine in most cases. Maybe the big block, I don't know. I didn't look into that. But if you're using a Mopar or a Ford engine, get a Ford or Mopar transmission to go with it. It's best to pair it. Yeah, there's adapter kits out there, but why spend money you don't have to? But it is important to note, though, that the flywheel is designed for the engine. So the flywheel that came with your S10, first of all, it's not going to fit a V8, but it just doesn't do the job. Do your homework and make sure that you get a flywheel that works for your engine and the power range that you're designing your engine to. Your basic advice for an automatic transmission is the same as with the manual. Your stock automatic transmission will work on your Willy's coupe if and only if you're using street tires. Anything bigger, you better go get a beefier transmission. There are guys that aftermarket upgrade people who do transmissions for higher horsepower. Keep in mind also there's no such thing as a universal bell housing. Make sure that you have those all are fitting. Now your 4L60 or any of the newer transmissions have a transmission control unit, TCU, and it communicates with the engine's ECU over a CAN bus. And when you demand more power, it just downshifts over this CAN bus. And prior to ECUs and TCUs, the communication between the engine and the transmission for this downshift was over what's called a TV cable or throttle valve cable. It's just a linkage, and it does the same thing. It's just a manual linkage instead of an electronic signal. Bottom hand, do your compatibility checks before you put any money out. You just got to do your homework on this stuff. If you go on websites such as Summit Racing to select a torque converter, the first thing that'll really pop out to you is there's a lot of brands and a lot of models of torque converters for your transmission. You don't just pick one willy-nilly. The best advice is to pick a brand you like, has good reputations, and call their technical sales rep. He's going to ask you all kinds of questions in order to pick the right torque converter for your application. Your vehicle purpose. Are you going to just be a daily driver, just a show car? Are you going to be on the oval track? Are you going to drag race? The engine and any modifications, particularly cam data. The transmission, is it stock or modified? What's your rear differential ratio? What's your rear tire diameter? These are all important. We need to talk about mounting the transmission. Now, the bell housing issue is one thing, and you do your homework on that. Make sure that the transmission is going to mate up with your engine. Then it comes time to put it in the vehicle. Now, the transmission crossbar, that's where it mounts at the back end of the transmission. Anyway, the stock one that your S10 came with just isn't going to do the job because you've got the engine's in a different location. It's a different engine, it's a different transmission in many cases. And, you've moved it back. So it's just, you're going to have a lot of modifications to it to make it work. There are some universal transmission cross members. They work with not a whole lot of modifications. But what's important here, the issue or the takeaway that you need to understand, is when it comes time to service the transmission, the mechanics really like to be able to remove that crossbar to get the transmission out. So you want to take that into consideration. This is my 700 R4 transmission. I've got the engine off right now, and so we can see the torque converter. Now, a torque converter is actually a pretty simple device. These three screws here, bolts I should say, bolt to the flex plate, which is mounted on the back of the engine. And it kind of acts like a hydraulic clutch, if you want to call it, or a fluid clutch. Now, not all, you can't just put any torque converter in your transmission. You have to get one that's rated for your engine, and of course fits your transmission. And when I say rated for your engine, in my case I put a mild cam in, so I had to put a special torque converter that has the ratings for a Chevy 350 with a mild cam. And this one is by TCI. It's called the Saturday Night Special. It's really kind of simple. You fill fluid in it, about a quart of transmission fluid, and slide it right over the splines of your transmission. And then after you've bolted it up to the engine, you just use these bolts here and connect it to the flywheel. Now, there are some tolerances. You want to make sure that you're at a certain specified distance from the back plane of the bell housing to this inner surface here where the flex wheel mates. And then you subtract out some thicknesses of your flex plate. And that's so you have your torque converter exactly where it needs to be to get best performance. If you have it too tight, you're going to damage it trying to crush the bell housing onto the, with, if this is too thick. If it's too thin, you don't have all the grip you need. It's designed that way in the event that somebody puts on an aftermarket flex plate that may be thicker or thinner, or if you've got some oddball bell housing that's off by a little bit for whatever reason. But anyway, there's some YouTube videos that you can look at that will help you make sure that when you put your torque converter in, that you have it exactly where it needs to be for the final results to work out the way you want them to. Back here is a sensor that senses the speed of the drive shaft, and has a line that goes up and connects it to your speedometer. You know how fast you're going. This is an upgrade over stock. This transmission's from the 80s, and it had just basically a cable that went up, and the cable would spin inside a sheath and mechanically connect to the speedometer. But all the gauges you're going to get nowadays are all electronic. See, this is an upgrade to convert it from it's a manual spinner to a digital signal. There's your power to the transmission. There's a little valve or two in there that needs that. It's only about 12 volts, 5 amps. It's not a big circuit. I've gone ahead and I put part of the shift linkage on already. My particular system I bought is the B&M hammer shifter, and it will mount to the floor of the tunnel, not to the transmission. There's some other brands. Low Car builds one that kind of connects back in here and actually physically adapts to the back end of your transmission case. Those are great if you're not going to put a big fancy console in your car, because the shifter's right down on the floor. There'll be just a hole you'll drill in your tunnel, and then put a grommet in it so you don't have water splashing up all the time while you're driving. And that keeps everything the way it is, the way it should be. Anyway, those are the two styles of it. I went with the B&M, as I mentioned earlier, the B&M hammer shifter, and it has a cable linkage rather than a hard mechanical linkage. It will wrap around, and I'll build it up in a console up off the tunnel. That's pretty much all I can say about a transmission, other than there's some YouTube videos that will go into how to put your, I mentioned earlier, that's the critical part, the torque converter position relative to the back housing here. Over here on the side of the transmission, this is the transmission fill tube. Here's a dipstick here, and this will bolt right onto the transmission bell housing once I get the engine on. There's another style that mounts to the firewall. I really don't like using that because I don't like to punch any more holes than I have to into my firewall. But if I have a fitment problem, once I get the body here and it doesn't clear, I'm going to have to go with the other system. These are the cool, send and return lines for cooling your transmission. Automatic transmissions do have to be cooled, those of you who are not familiar with that. I just want to say something about that. What really heats an automatic transmission up is if you're pulling a trailer, or if you have a pickup with a heavy load in it, you want to stay out of overdrive when you're cruising long distances, because that really heats up the transmission. You won't be able to go as fast if you just keep it down there out of overdrive. In your, if you got a 4-speed transmission, put it in third and cruise at that. You're pulling a trailer and stuff, but that helps your transmission last a whole lot longer. It's just a tip. And this is the throttle valve cable. When you want to pass or someone like that, and you want to downshift, you push your foot down, and this connects the other end to your throttle valve. So when you open up that valve, it kicks your transmission down a gear. Now the newer transmission, the newer version of this, the 4L60, I think it is, or 4L40, heck, whatever. That's all done electronically through the CAN bus system. And you have a little
what do you call it? A transmission control, TCU, transmission control unit. It does that. It's a simple computer. A lot of, it works one way or the other. You just got to put the right equipment with the right setup that you've got.
Well, that about wraps it up for transmissions. When it really comes down to the bottom line, on cost, it can vary a lot depending on what options are available to you at the time that fits within your schedule of your build. And taste. Some people like the manual transmission. Some people prefer the automatic. Now, I went with the automatic transmission for a reason that may seem a little strange to some people, but others can perfectly understand it. I'd like my wife to drive the car once in a while, and she has no concept of a clutch. Same with many of my friends and family. I would like to have friends and family have the experience of driving this car, and many of them do not really understand how to run a clutch. And with the shifters you can get these days, you can still have sort of manual control. That's what I've got in my Porsche, and I kind of enjoy it. My next video is going to be on I have installed a triangulated rear suspension system, and the reason I did that is I wanted a control of ride quality and of ride height, and it's going to be pretty interesting. So stay tuned for the next one. Thank you. Bye.